I've always believed in the quiet strength of routine. My name is Daniel Carter, a 42-year-old architect living in a sprawling suburban house in Portland with my wife, Emily, and our 2 kids, Sophie and Ethan. Emily's a freelance graphic designer. Her workspace a chaotic corner of our home filled with sketches and coffee mugs. We've been married for 17 years, and I thought I knew her. Every laugh line around her hazel eyes, every quirk in her voice when she teased me about my obsession with perfectly aligned blueprints. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, built brick by brick through late-night talks and shared dreams. That's why, when the first crack appeared, I didn't see it for what it was. Started with a name, Ryan Gosling. Not the actor, mind you, but a real guy, her client. She'd mentioned him casually over dinner one night, her fork twirling spaghetti as she described his visionary ideas for a branding project. "He's intense," she'd said, her cheeks flushing slightly. I'd laughed it off, teasing her about her celebrity crush doppelganger. She'd rolled her eyes, but there was something in her smile, a flicker I couldn't place. Over the next few weeks, Ryan's name crept into our conversations like ivy climbing a wall. "Ryan loved the mock-up," she'd say, or "Ryan's got this wild energy." I didn't mind at first. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? Then came the late nights. Emily started staying up past midnight, her laptop glowing in the dimness of our living room. I'd wake up to an empty bed, padding downstairs to find her hunched over her desk, headphones on, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Just finishing something for Ryan," she'd mutter, barely glancing at me. I'd nod, kiss the top of her head, and shuffle back to bed, convincing myself it was just a big project. But the air in our house began to shift, thicker, heavier, like the calm before a storm I didn't know was coming. One Tuesday, I came home early from a site inspection. The kids were at soccer practice, and I'd planned to surprise Emily with takeout from her favorite Thai place. The house was quiet when I walked in, save for a faint murmur from her office. I set the bags down and crept closer, not wanting to interrupt if she was on a call. Through the cracked door, I saw her, head thrown back, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in years. Her phone was pressed to her ear, and her voice was low, playful. "Oh, come on, Ryan, you're ridiculous," she said, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. My stomach tightened. It wasn't the words. It was the tone. Intimate, unguarded, alive. I stood there, frozen, the takeout cooling on the counter behind me, as the first seed of doubt took root. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I swallowed the unease and played the part of the oblivious husband. We ate the Thai food, her chatter about color palettes and deadlines filling the space between us. But I watched her closer now, how her eyes darted to her phone every few minutes, how her fingers lingered on the screen before she set it face down. I told myself I was overreacting. Emily wasn't the type to stray. She'd always been the steady one, the anchor when my temper flared or the kids tested our patience. Yet, that laugh I'd heard stuck with me, replaying in my mind like a song I couldn't shake. The next day, I did something I'd never done before. I checked her phone. She'd left it charging in the kitchen while she showered, and the temptation clawed at me. My hands shook as I swiped through her messages. There it was, a thread with Ryan G. Stretching back weeks. The early texts were professional. "Here's the draft. Can we tweak the logo?" But then they shifted. "You're too much," she'd written one night, followed by a winking emoji. His reply, "Only for you." My chest burned as I scrolled further. Jokes, compliments, a photo of him shirtless at the gym captioned, "Post-workout vibes." Her response, "Well, damn." I set the phone down, my vision blurring. This wasn't just a client relationship. I started paying attention to everything. Her wardrobe changed. New dresses, tighter jeans, a perfume I didn't recognize. She'd leave the house more often, claiming meetings that lasted hours. Once, I drove by the coffee shop she'd mentioned, peering through the window to see her and Ryan leaning close over a table, her hand brushing his arm. My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. I didn't storm in. I drove home, the image searing itself into my brain. That night, she came back humming, her lips glossy with a shade of red I'd never seen her wear. "Good meeting?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "Great," she said, smiling too brightly. I nodded, and the seed of doubt sprouted into something darker. I began to dig. Ryan Gosling, real name Ryan Gregory, was a 38-year-old entrepreneur with a startup in digital marketing. A quick search online revealed his LinkedIn, his Instagram, his life. Single, charming, with a grin that could sell anything. I found his address in a sleek downtown loft, his car a flashy Tesla parked out front. I drove by once, twice, memorizing the details. He was real, tangible, and he was worming his way into my marriage. I didn't know what they were doing. Not yet. But I knew it wasn't innocent, and I knew I couldn't let it stand. The days blurred into a haze of suspicion and silence. I stopped sleeping properly, lying awake beside Emily as she breathed softly, oblivious to the war raging in my head. I'd study her face in the moonlight, those familiar features now alien, hiding secrets I couldn't unsee. I became a detective in my own home, noting every inconsistency. She'd say she was at the library, but her shoes were spotless, no trace of the muddy parking lot. She'd claim a deadline kept her late, but her laptop history showed hours on Instagram, not Photoshop. The lies piled up, each one a brick in the wall between us. I needed proof. One Saturday, while she took the kids to a movie, I tore through her office. I found a notebook tucked beneath a stack of design books, its pages filled with doodles and scribbled notes. Amid the chaos, a date caught my eye. 7 p.m., the Ivy. The Ivy was a swanky bar downtown, not a place for client meetings. My pulse quickened. I cross-checked her calendar. Sure enough, she'd marked that night as work thing. I sat back, the notebook trembling in my hands. She was meeting him. Tonight, I decided to follow her. When she left, dolled up in a black dress and heels, I kissed her goodbye like nothing was wrong. "Have fun," I said, forcing a smile. She didn't notice the edge in my voice. I waited 10 minutes, then tailed her in my truck, keeping my distance. She parked near the Ivy, and I watched from across the street as she stepped inside. Through the window, I saw her slide into a booth, Ryan already there, his hand resting casually on the table. They leaned in, their laughter cutting through the glass like a blade. My fists clenched. This wasn't a meeting. This was a date. I stayed for an hour, snapping photos with my phone, her hand on his arm around her shoulders as they left. They didn't see me, didn't know I was there, documenting every moment. When she came home, smelling faintly of his cologne, I asked how her night went. "Fine," she said, avoiding my eyes. I nodded, the photos burning a hole in my pocket. I didn't confront her then. I wanted more, enough to bury her in the truth she thought I'd never find. The betrayal wasn't just in the meetings or the messages. It was in the way she rewrote our life. I started noticing how she pulled away from me, how her touches grew perfunctory, her smiles mechanical. We'd sit on the couch, the kids asleep upstairs, and she'd scroll through her phone, her face lighting up at some private joke I wasn't part of. I'd ask what was funny, and she'd shrug. Just a meme. But I knew. It was him. Ryan had infiltrated our home, our marriage, without ever stepping through the door. I upped my game. I installed a tracking app on her phone during one of her showers, syncing it to my laptop. The first ping came the next day. She was at his loft. Not a coffee shop, not a bar, but his home. My stomach churned as I stared at the blinking dot on the map. She told me she was running errands. I drove there, parking a block away, and watched her car in his driveway. 2 hours later, she emerged, her hair slightly mussed, her stride too casual. I snapped more photos, my hands shaking with rage. This wasn't flirtation anymore. This was intimacy. I confronted her that night, testing the waters. "Where were you today?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Oh, just the store," she said, chopping vegetables like nothing was amiss. "Which one?" I pressed. She hesitated barely a second, but I caught it. "Whole Foods," she lied. I nodded, letting it drop, but the confirmation hit me like a punch. She was covering her tracks, and poorly. I spent the next week gathering evidence. Screenshots, location logs, a hidden recorder in her purse that caught her giggling with him about last time. Each piece fueled the fire inside me. I met Ryan once, by chance, at a networking event she dragged me to. He was all charm, tall, broad-shouldered, with a handshake that lingered too long. "Heard so much about you," he said, his eyes glinting with something I now recognized as mockery. Emily stood beside him, radiant, introducing us like it was nothing. I smiled through gritted teeth, knowing he'd already taken something from me. That night replayed in my mind as I planned my next move. He thought he'd won. He was wrong. Revenge didn't come quickly. I wanted it to be precise, devastating, a reckoning they'd never see coming. I kept up the facade, kissing Emily good morning, asking about her day, pretending I didn't know her soul was elsewhere. Inside, I was unraveling, but I channeled it into strategy. I'd always been good at building things. Now I'd build their downfall. The kids noticed the tension. Sophie asked why I was so quiet. Ethan why mommy was always busy. I brushed it off, shielding them from the truth. They'd understand later. I hired a private investigator, a grizzled guy named Paul who'd seen it all. "Give me a week," he said, pocketing my deposit. He delivered in 5 days. A dossier thick with photos, timestamps, even a grainy video of Emily slipping into Ryan's loft, her arms around his neck as the door closed. Paul didn't judge. He just handed me the evidence and said, "You've got options." I did. Legal ones, sure, divorce, alimony fights, but that wasn't enough. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they'd done, to lose more than I had. I started with Ryan's business. His startup relied on reputation, a shiny veneer of innovation. I dug into his online presence, finding disgruntled ex-clients on obscure forums. Posing as a concerned colleague, I emailed his biggest investors, attaching anonymous tips about unprofessional conduct with married collaborators. I leaked snippets of his flirty texts with Emily to a local gossip blog, framing it as a whistleblower scoop. Within days, his social media buzzed with speculation, his pristine image cracking. He'd never trace it back to me, not yet. For Emily, I went deeper. I accessed our joint accounts, rerouting funds into a new one she couldn't touch. I met with a lawyer, quietly preparing papers to secure the house and custody. But the real blow was personal. I found her old college friend, Lisa, who'd always disliked me. I fed Lisa half-truths, Emily's stress, her new guy, knowing she'd spread it through their circle. Soon, Emily's phone lit up with concerned texts from friends, her lies unraveling in real time. She'd come home flustered, muttering about rumors, and I'd play dumb, watching her squirm. The trap was set, and I was just getting started. The house felt like a stage now, every interaction a performance. Emily moved through our days with a distracted air, her mind clearly elsewhere, while I sharpened my plans in the shadows. I'd watch her sip coffee, her lips brushing the mug I'd bought her years ago, and wonder how she could sit there so calmly, pretending. The kids sensed it too. Sophie's questions grew sharper, Ethan's silence heavier, but I kept them close, weaving a fragile normalcy to shield them. My revenge wasn't for them to bear. Not yet. Ryan's world was crumbling faster than I'd expected. The investor emails and blog leak had sparked a firestorm. His startup stock dipped, clients pulled out, and his polished Instagram feed filled with cryptic posts about tough times. I'd sip my whiskey at night, scrolling through the chaos I'd sown, a grim satisfaction settling in. But it wasn't enough. I wanted him humiliated, stripped bare in a way he couldn't recover from. So I went further. Using a burner phone, I contacted a hacker I'd found through Paul's shady network. "Ruin him," I said, wiring the payment. Within days, Ryan's personal accounts, emails, cloud storage were breached. Photos of him with Emily, candid and compromising, landed in my inbox. I didn't flinch. I forwarded them anonymously to his business partners, letting the fallout spread. Emily noticed the shift in him too. She'd come home rattled, muttering about Ryan's stress and unfair rumors. I'd nod sympathetically, masking the thrill of watching her orbit destabilize. Sounds rough, I'd say, pouring her wine, knowing she'd lean on me for comfort while I twisted the knife. Her phone buzzed less now. Ryan was too busy scrambling to charm her, and I savored the irony. She'd chosen him over me, and now he was a liability she couldn't escape. I let her stew in it, her confidence fraying as her secret life bled into the open. Then came the first real blow to her. Lisa's gossip had worked its magic. Emily's friends started pulling away, their texts turning cold or overly curious. "Are you okay?" they'd ask, fishing for cracks. She'd brush it off, but I saw the strain in her eyes, the way she'd linger in the bathroom mirror, questioning herself. I fed the fire subtly, offhand comments about people talking at the kids' school, vague hints about someone asking me odd questions. She'd pale, change the subject, but the doubt gnawed at her. I wanted her isolated, surrounded by whispers she couldn't silence. The kids became my anchor as the plan deepened. Sophie, with her sharp wit, and Ethan, with his quiet resilience, deserved better than a mother who'd traded our family for a fling. I started documenting everything, her absences, her lies, building a case for custody. The lawyer, a stern woman named Claire, nodded approvingly at my meticulous notes. "You're in a strong position," she said, outlining how Emily's behavior could sway a judge. I didn't care about fairness anymore. I cared about winning. The house, the kids, our life. I'd keep it all and she'd have nothing. Ryan's ruin accelerated. The hacker's work exposed more than just his affair. Financial discrepancies, shady deals, a trail of arrogance that turned his allies against him. His startup folded under the scrutiny, headlines screaming about misconduct and betrayal. I watched from afar as he lost the loft, the Tesla, his swagger. A grainy photo of him loading boxes into a beat-up sedan surfaced online, and I printed it, tucking it into my desk drawer like a trophy. He'd been her golden boy, her escape. Now he was a cautionary tale, and she was tied to his wreckage. Emily's unraveling was quieter but no less satisfying. Her freelance gigs dried up. Clients didn't want the drama of a homewrecker on their payroll. She'd pace the kitchen, ranting about unfairness, oblivious that I'd tipped off her biggest accounts with anonymous warnings. "It'll blow over," I'd say, feigning support, while her inbox stayed empty. Her friend's distance grew. She'd call Lisa, only to get voicemail, her voice trembling as she left messages. I'd overhear her late at night, whispering to Ryan on the phone, their tones desperate. "We'll figure it out," she'd say. But I knew they wouldn't. I'd already cut too deep. I escalated at home. I changed the Wi-Fi password, locking her out of her digital lifeline, claiming it was a glitch. Her frustration mounted as she fumbled with resets, her dependence on me growing even as I pulled away. I'd leave for work trips, really just drives to nowhere, letting her stew in the silence. The kids asked where I went, and I'd smile, just clearing my head. They didn't need to know I was plotting, refining the final act. Emily's world was shrinking, and I was the architect of its collapse. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday. Emily sat at the dining table, her laptop open, staring at a rejection email from a longtime client. "They're dropping me," she said, her voice hollow. I murmured something consoling, but inside, I cheered. That client had been her lifeline, and I'd nudged them away with a well-placed rumor about her reliability. She looked at me then, really looked, and I wondered if she saw the steel behind my eyes. "What's happening to us?" she asked, almost to herself. I shrugged, letting her question hang unanswered. She didn't deserve an explanation, not yet. Ryan reached out to me that week, a desperate move I hadn't anticipated. His email landed in my inbox, all false bravado and pleas. "Dan, we need to talk. This isn't what you think." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound before deleting it. He didn't get to call me Dan. He didn't get to explain. But it gave me an idea. I forwarded his message to Emily from a dummy account, attaching one of the compromising photos with a note. "He's begging your husband now." Pathetic. She'd see it, panic, and turn to Ryan, only to find him flailing. Divide and conquer, I'd learned it well. Her reaction was immediate. She stormed into my office that night, eyes wild. "Did Ryan contact you?" she demanded. I played dumb, frowning. "No, why would he?" she faltered, clutching her phone, then muttered something about a mistake and fled. I knew she'd call him, accuse him, and their fragile alliance would crack further. It did. Paul's recorder caught her sobbing to Ryan later. "You're making this worse." His voice, strained and defensive, snapped back. "You're the one who started this." I smiled into the darkness, their bond fracturing under my design. I tightened the noose at home. I accidentally left bank statements out, showing the new account she couldn't access. "Where's our savings?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Oh, I moved some things around," I said casually, watching her panic bloom. She couldn't confront me fully, not without admitting her own guilt, and I reveled in her trapped silence. The kids noticed her fraying too. Sophie asked if Mommy was sick, and I hugged her, whispering, "She's just tired." Soon, they'd know the truth, but not before I dismantled everything Emily held dear. Emily's desperation grew palpable. She'd linger near me now, seeking reassurance I wouldn't give. "Are we okay?" she'd ask, her voice small. I'd nod, distant, letting her stew in the ambiguity. Her freelance career was dead, her social circle a graveyard of unanswered calls, and Ryan, her shining knight, was a broken man sleeping on a friend's couch, according to Paul's latest report. I'd stripped them of everything they'd built together, but the final act loomed. I wanted them to face each other in their ruin, to see the cost of their choices reflected in hollow eyes. I staged a confrontation. Using the burner, I texted Emily as Ryan, "Meet me at the Ivy. We need to end this." Then I texted Ryan as her, "Ivy, tonight. No more games." Neither would suspect the other hadn't sent it. They were too afraid, too paranoid. I waited across the street, hood up, as they arrived separately, confusion turning to fury when they saw each other. Emily's voice carried through the drizzle. "You dragged me here?" Ryan's reply was sharp. "You texted me." They argued, voices rising, oblivious to me, snapping photos of their public collapse. Passers-by stared, whispers spreading, and I knew the night would haunt them both. Back home, Emily was a wreck, pale, pacing, muttering about Ryan's nonsense. I asked what was wrong, feigning concern, and she snapped, "Nothing you'd understand." I let it slide, knowing she'd just torched her last bridge. Ryan's text to her stopped that night. Paul confirmed he'd blocked her, his pride finally outweighing his desperation. She was alone now, truly alone, and I tightened my grip. I met Claire again, finalizing the divorce papers. "She won't see it coming," Claire said, and I nodded. The kids would stay with me. Emily's instability was documented, her lies exposed. I planted one last seed. I accidentally left a printed email from Claire on the counter. Divorce terms, custody demands, all laid out. Emily found it that evening, her gasp echoing through the house. "Daniel, what is this?" she cried, storming into the living room. I looked up from my book, calm as stone. "What it looks like," I said. She crumpled, tears streaming, begging me to talk. I didn't. I stood, walked upstairs, and locked the bedroom door, leaving her to drown in the wreckage I'd built. The fallout was swift and brutal. Emily moved through the house like a ghost, her eyes red-rimmed, her voice hoarse from pleading. "We can fix this," she'd say, clutching my arm. I'd pull away, silent, letting her words crash against the wall I'd erected. The kids watched, confused, and I sat them down one night, keeping it simple. "Mommy and I need time apart," I said, hugging them tight. Sophie cried, Ethan nodded, and I promised them stability, something Emily couldn't offer anymore. She overheard, her sob cutting through the hall, but I didn't turn back. Ryan's end was uglier. Paul sent me a final update. He'd been evicted from his friend's place, his reputation too toxic for even pity. A blurry photo showed him at a dive bar, unshaven, staring into a glass. I framed it beside the sedan shot, a gallery of his descent. His name faded from Emily's lips, her fling reduced to a bitter memory. She'd call out to me sometimes, "I didn't mean for this," but I'd walk away. She didn't get to rewrite the story now. I served her the papers a week later. Claire had crafted a masterpiece. Full custody, the house, most of our assets, citing her emotional neglect and unstable conduct. Emily's hands shook as she read, her voice breaking. "You can't take them from me," she whispered. "You already left them," I said, my tone ice. She signed, defeated, her fight gone. I'd won the legal battle, but the real victory was her despair. The way she'd look at me, knowing I'd outplayed her at every turn. The kids adjusted slowly, their questions fading as I filled our days with routine, school runs, movie nights, blueprints spread across the table. Emily moved into a cramped apartment downtown, her visits supervised, her presence a shadow. I'd catch her staring at Sophie and Ethan, longing in her eyes, and feel a cold triumph. She'd chosen Ryan, chosen herself, and I'd made sure she'd live with nothing but regret. The revenge was complete, but the final twist, the cruelest, was still to come. The weeks after Emily moved out were a strange calm, like the silence after a storm has razed everything to the ground. The kids settled into a rhythm with me. Sophie's chatter filling the kitchen, Ethan's quiet focus on his homework grounding us. I'd rebuilt our home into something solid, a fortress against the chaos she'd left behind. But beneath the surface, my mind churned. Victory wasn't enough. I needed her to feel the full weight of her choices, to carry a scar as deep as the one she'd carved into me. Ryan's ruin was complete, but Emily's punishment was still unfolding. I kept tabs on her through Paul, who'd taken a quiet interest in the aftermath. She'd found a part-time gig at a print shop, a far cry from her freelance glory. Her days spent folding flyers instead of designing them. Her apartment was a dingy one-bedroom, its windows overlooking a noisy street. Paul sent photos, her hunched over a cheap table, eating alone, her face drawn. I studied them, tracing the lines of her exhaustion, and felt no pity. She'd chosen this, I reminded myself, and I'd make sure she never forgot it. The kids' supervised visits with her were my next lever. I'd drop them off at a neutral spot, a park, a cafe, watching from a distance as she tried to reclaim their affection. Sophie would hug her, hesitant, while Ethan stayed stiff, his trust eroded. Emily's smiles were forced, her voice cracking as she asked about their days. I'd instructed them to keep it light, to avoid mentioning our new routines, and they obeyed, sensing the unspoken rules. Each visit chipped away at her, her desperation growing as she realized the bond she'd taken for granted was slipping through her fingers. I planted a final seed with her friends. I met Lisa for coffee, playing the wounded husband with just enough vulnerability to hook her. "She's struggling," I said, letting my voice waver. "I don't know how to help her." Lisa's eyes softened, but I knew she'd spread it. Emily's downfall, her isolation, framed as concern. Soon, the last of her circle stopped calling, their pity turning to distance. I'd stripped her of her work, her lover, her children, and now her community. She was an island, and I was the tide that had swept everything away. The kids asked about her less as spring turned to summer. Sophie's drawings shifted from family portraits to scenes of just the three of us. Ethan's silences grew less heavy. I filled their lives with purpose. Camping trips, late-night stargazing, blueprints they doodle on with crayons. Our home became ours again, Emily's absence a fading echo. But I wasn't done. Revenge isn't just destruction. It's legacy, a story they'd carry forever. I wanted her to see what she'd lost, to live with it etched into her bones. I orchestrated a chance encounter. I took the kids to a local fair, knowing Emily sometimes walked its edges, clinging to memories of better days. We were there, Sophie with cotton candy, Ethan clutching a prize from a ring toss. When she appeared, her steps faltering as she saw us. I nodded coolly, letting her approach. "Hi, babies," she said, her voice trembling. Sophie waved, Ethan mumbled a greeting, but their eyes drifted back to me, their anchor. Emily's face crumpled as she registered it, their loyalty, their ease without her. "Having fun?" she asked, grasping for connection. "Yeah," I said, stepping between them. "We're good." She flinched, and I walked away, the kids in tow, leaving her stranded in the crowd. That night, Paul sent me a text. She'd been seen at a bar, alone, nursing a drink. I imagined her replaying the fare, the indifference in Sophie's wave, Ethan's guarded stare. It was a dagger I twisted without lifting a finger. I leaned back in my chair, the house quiet around me, and planned the next move. She'd lost everything tangible. Home, career, friends. But I wanted her spirit broken, her identity erased. I contacted a local gallery where she'd once dreamed of showing her work, anonymously tipping them off about her unreliable past. They'd never call her now. Another door slammed shut. The kids' school became my final battlefield. I volunteered more field trips, bake sales, cementing my role as the steady parent. Teachers whispered about Emily's situation, their sympathy tilting toward me. I didn't correct them. When report cards came, I framed Sophie's A's and Ethan's B's on the wall, a shrine to our new life. Emily's visits dwindled. She'd cancel, citing work. But I knew it was shame. I'd won them completely, and she knew it. Fall brought a chill, and with it, Emily's final descent. Paul's updates grew sparse. She'd stopped leaving her apartment much, her job hanging by a thread. I drove by once, peering through the grimy window to see her curled on a couch, a blanket around her shoulders, staring at nothing. The sight should have stirred something, regret, maybe, but all I felt was cold resolve. She'd built her cage. I just handed her the key and watched her lock herself in. I turned my focus to permanence. I redecorated the house, erasing her traces. New paint, new furniture. Her old office now a gym for the kids. Sophie asked about a photo of us all once, tucked in a drawer. "It's old," I said, and she didn't press. I filed for full custody, citing her unstable lifestyle, and Claire assured me it'd sail through. Emily didn't fight it. Her signature came back shaky, resigned. The kids were mine legally, emotionally, irrevocably. She'd lost her claim to them, to us. Ryan resurfaced briefly, a blip on my radar. Paul spotted him in a neighboring city, working a dead-end sales job, his charm buried under a cheap suit. I sent him one last message from the burner. A photo of Emily at the fair, alone with the caption, "She's all yours." He didn't reply. Couldn't, probably. But I knew it'd sting, a reminder of their shared ruin. I deleted the burner after that, severing the last tie to his world. He was a ghost now, and she was fading into one. The cruelest twist came naturally. Sophie's birthday rolled around, and she wanted a party. Just us and a few friends. I suggested inviting Emily, testing the waters. Sophie shrugged. "If she wants." I called her voice neutral. "Sophie's turning 12. She'd like you there." Emily's silence stretched, then a choked, "Okay." She arrived late, clutching a store-bought cake, her smile brittle as the kids barely glanced at her. I watched her hover, an outsider in her daughter's life, and felt the triumph settle deep. She left early, tears in her eyes, and I knew she'd never come back. Winter hardened everything, our routines, my resolve, Emily's isolation. The kids thrived, their laughter a balm against the past. I'd sit with them at night, Ethan sketching beside me, Sophie reading aloud, and marvel at how we'd healed without her. She'd call sometimes, her voice thin over the line, asking to talk to them. I'd hand the phone over, watching their polite detachment. Short answers, quick goodbyes. She was a formality now, a name they'd outgrow. I'd take the phone back, her breathing heavy, and hang up without a word. Paul's last report was a single photo. Emily at a bus stop, coat too thin for the snow, her face gaunt. I didn't need more. She was a shell, her life a monochrome blur. I'd dismantled her piece by piece, and now she'd live with the echo of what she'd thrown away. I burned the photo, the gallery of her and Ryan's downfall reduced to ash. The kids didn't need to see it. They had me, and that was enough. I staged one final act, subtle but piercing. I donated her old design books to the school, her name scrawled inside, letting them circulate among parents who'd whisper her story. A teacher thanked me, unaware, and I smiled, knowing Emily would hear of it eventually, her passion repurposed, her mark erased. She'd called me once after, furious. "Why would you do that?" I stayed calm. "They were just collecting dust." She hung up, and I knew it'd hit her hard. Another piece of her identity stripped away. The kids asked about her one snowy night, rare curiosity breaking through. "Is Mommy happy?" Sophie wondered. I paused, choosing truth over comfort. "I don't know," I said. "She made choices, and they led her somewhere else." They nodded, accepting it, and we moved on. Hot cocoa, a movie, our world intact. Emily's absence was a fact now, not a wound, and I'd ensured it'd stay that way. Spring arrived, and with it, closure. The kids turned to me fully. Sophie's art pinned to the fridge, Ethan's quiet trust in our talks. I'd built them a life she couldn't touch, a legacy of resilience she'd never share. Paul called one last time, voice gruff. "She's gone quiet. Moved somewhere cheap, out of state." I didn't ask where. It didn't matter. She'd vanished from our orbit, a footnote in a story I'd rewritten. I took the kids to the coast that summer, a tradition she'd once loved. We built sandcastles, laughed at the waves, and I watched them run ahead, free. I kept my promise: stability, love, a future. Emily's betrayal had lit the fuse, but I'd turned it into something stronger. Her revenge was living with nothing, no family, no pride, no hope, while we thrived. I'd heard through Lisa she'd tried calling once, leaving a voicemail I never played. I deleted it, letting her voice dissolve into the past. The cruelest part wasn't the loss I'd engineered. It was the mirror I'd held up. She'd see herself in every empty room, every unanswered call, knowing she'd chosen Ryan, chosen fleeting thrills, and paid with everything. I'd given her a life sentence of regret. No parole, no escape. The kids didn't need her. I didn't want her. We were whole, and she was a shadow, fading further with each season. Years later, Sophie asked if I'd forgiven her. I thought of Emily, alone, broken, a stranger to us, and smiled faintly. "Forgiveness isn't the point," I said. "We moved on, and we had." The house stood firm, the kids grew tall, and I found peace in the wreckage I'd turned to gold. She'd betrayed me, but I'd won. Utterly, cruelly, completely. The end was hers to live. The victory was mine to keep.